My father laughed at my dress blues on Christmas Eve, 2019, in front of 40 relatives, and said, "Your sister is the real soldier, Sarah. You're just playing dress up." I was a lieutenant colonel, with 12 years of service, and a Bronze Star I wasn't allowed to talk about. I said nothing. 6 months later, in a courtroom in Fairfax County, Virginia, a 2-star general walked in, wearing his full dress uniform, and saluted me first, before he saluted the judge. If you've ever had your service, your work, or your sacrifice reduced to a punchline by someone who was supposed to know better, comment the city you're watching from right now, then hit like and subscribe, because this story is for every person who was underestimated by their own family. The wool of my service uniform, the cold marble of the courthouse steps outside, the exact click of a gavel against a wooden block. I remember every texture of that January morning, with a precision I usually reserve only for combat. There were 3 things nobody in that courtroom knew when the hearing started. The first was that my ex-husband's attorney was about to accuse me, under oath, of faking a brain injury to inflate my disability claim, using a sealed medical file that had been quietly subpoenaed. The second was that 11 years earlier, in a valley outside Kandahar, I had done something that the United States government still classified as top secret, something my own father had never once asked me about, because he'd already decided he knew what I did for a living. The third was that my husband, Marcus, had been planning to leave me for 14 months before he actually did it, and he chose the exact week I collapsed in our kitchen to file the paperwork. 3 threads, 1 courtroom, and a general who was about to make every person in that gallery understand exactly who I was. I need to take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how quietly the lie got built. I enlisted at 19, 3 weeks after my sister Kate left for Army basic training herself, and from that day forward, my family had already decided which Doyle daughter was the real soldier. Kate went infantry adjacent, combat arms support, and she came home with stories she could tell at the dinner table. Convoy runs, forward operating bases, the kind of thing that made my father's chest puff out at the VFW hall in Manassas. I went into military intelligence, then cross-trained into a program that doesn't have a name you'll find in any recruiting brochure, coordinating classified medevac and combat search and rescue logistics for special operations task forces across 3 deployments. My paperwork, officially, said Logistics Officer, Support Battalion. That was the cover. That was always the cover. And because it was the cover, it was the only thing my family ever heard. My father, Frank Doyle, was a Vietnam-era Navy man himself, 22 years in, and he had a very specific idea of what real service looked like. Mud, gunfire, a story you could tell over beer. When I tried, exactly once, at a 4th of July barbecue in 2016, to explain that my work involved things I legally could not discuss, he laughed, the exact same laugh he'd used 3 years later over Christmas dinner, and said, "Sure, sweetheart, top secret paperwork." My mother, Linda, never contradicted him. She just refilled his glass and changed the subject, the way she'd been doing since 1987. Kate, to her credit, never mocked me outright, but she also never corrected him. She let the story stand because the story was flattering to her, and I understood that, and I filed it away the same place I filed everything else, a locked box in the back of my mind labeled later. I met Marcus Whitfield Kessler in 2014 at a fundraiser in Alexandria, Virginia, while I was stationed at the Pentagon between deployments. He was 31, a junior associate at a mid-sized firm called Bramwell & Cross, 6'2", expensive haircut, the kind of handshake that lasts half a second too long, because he's already decided you're worth the investment. He told me, on our second date, that he found military women fascinating, and I remember thinking, even then, that the phrase sounded like something you'd say about an exhibit at a museum. I married him anyway, 18 months later, at a courthouse in Arlington, with 6 guests, because I loved the version of him that showed up when the cameras, figuratively, were off. That version got rarer every year. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Marcus told people at cocktail parties that his wife was in logistics, does a lot of scheduling stuff, very organized. I used to correct him, gently, and then I stopped. Because correcting him started arguments, and arguments in our house always ended the same way, with him telling me I was too sensitive for someone in the military. By 2018, when I made lieutenant colonel, he didn't come to the promotion ceremony. He had a deposition, he said. I believed him for 2 years before I found out there was no deposition scheduled that day. The first concrete pull in this story starts in March of 2023, 7 weeks before I filed for retirement paperwork, after 12 years, 4 months, and 11 days of service. I was sitting in my car outside Fort Belvoir when I got a call from Walter Reed. A sealed envelope, hand-delivered, no return address beyond a P.O. box in Alexandria, had been forwarded to my personnel file, a request from a neurology and behavioral health office to schedule a follow-up traumatic brain injury evaluation, referencing an incident from an operation in 2013 that I am still, to this day, not permitted to describe by name. That envelope sat in my glove box for 6 days before I opened it. Inside was a single line: re-evaluation required prior to VA disability rating finalization. Case flagged for review. I didn't know it yet, but that flagged case was about to become a weapon in my own divorce. The second thread, the one that would define the next year of my life, started the same month, though I didn't connect it until much later. Marcus had started coming home later. Not dramatically later, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, the kind of lateness that's easy to wave off. He'd started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. And in April, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a hotel in Georgetown, dated a Tuesday when he told me he was in Richmond for a case. I didn't confront him. I am not, by training or by temperament, someone who confronts before she has the full picture. I filed it, locked box, later. The collapse happened on a Sunday morning, June 4, 2023, at 7:14 a.m., in our kitchen in McLean, Virginia. I remember the time, because it's stamped on the 911 call log. I was making coffee when the left side of my vision folded in on itself like a curtain closing. And the next thing I remember with any clarity is the paramedic's gloved hand on my wrist and the smell of the tile floor, cold against my cheek. Marcus called it in. Marcus rode with me to Inova Fairfax. Marcus sat in the waiting room for 4 hours. And Marcus, I would later learn from the process server, who caught me still in a hospital gown 11 days later, had already had divorce papers drafted by an attorney named Roger Callahan for 6 weeks before that Sunday morning. The diagnosis came back 8 days later, a complex partial seizure, secondary to the traumatic brain injury I'd sustained in 2013. The same injury referenced in the sealed envelope in my glove box. The same injury my own service record, classified, could substantiate down to the hour, if anyone with the right clearance ever bothered to pull it. Marcus sat across from me in the neurologist's office, held my hand for the cameras that weren't there, and 3 days later served me with divorce papers that used the word malingering twice on page 4. I want you to understand who Roger Callahan is, because he shows up in almost every scene from here forward, and he never changes. Roger Callahan is 51 years old, drives a black Mercedes he leases through the firm, and has built an entire divorce practice on a single move. Find the spouse's vulnerability and turn it into a courtroom liability before they can turn it into sympathy. He met with Marcus twice before I even collapsed. His opening filing described my alleged medical condition as a convenient escalation, coinciding with the dissolution of the marriage, and in our first mediation session, in a glass conference room on the 9th floor of a building in Tyson's Corner, he looked directly at me and said, in the flat, rehearsed tone of a man who has said this sentence in a dozen other rooms, "Colonel Kessler, isn't it true that your entire military career has been, functionally, administrative work dressed up in a uniform?" I did not answer. I looked at my own attorney, and I waited. My attorney was Patricia Reyes, 61 years old, a former Army JAG officer, who'd spent 9 years as a military prosecutor before she went into private family law, specializing, almost exclusively, in representing service members and veterans in divorce and custody proceedings. Patricia had a way of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being filed into evidence somewhere behind her eyes. Which, I would learn, it was. When Callahan made that comment about my career being administrative work dressed up in a uniform, Patricia didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Careful, Roger. You're about to build your entire strategy on an assumption you can't verify, and I promise you, you don't want to find out how wrong that assumption is in open court." Callahan laughed it off. Everyone in that room laughed it off, except Patricia, and except me. Marcus's mother, Diane Kessler, had never liked me. Not because of anything I'd done, but because I represented a category of woman she didn't understand. One who didn't need her son's name or his firm's reputation to matter. Diane was 66, silver blonde, the kind of woman who wore her contempt like perfume, subtle until you were close enough to choke on it. At the first family gathering after the papers were filed, a birthday lunch for Marcus's niece, which I still attended because I refused to let this family push me out of rooms I had a right to be in, Diane cornered me by the dessert table and said quietly, so only I could hear, "You know, dear, some women use the military the way other women use pregnancy." As an excuse. I didn't respond. I picked up a slice of cake, thanked the host, and left. Diane said a version of that same sentence. She's using it as an excuse. To at least 4 other people over the following months, and every one of them repeated it back to me eventually, as if it were gossip instead of a wound. Then there was Whitney Prentice, 32, the paralegal Marcus had been seeing since at least that April hotel receipt in Georgetown, though it took until August for me to learn her name. Whitney worked, ironically, at a firm 2 floors below Callahan's, and she had a particular talent for calculated arrogance, the kind that never raises its voice, because it doesn't need to. I met her exactly twice. The first time was an accident, at a restaurant in Old Town Alexandria, where she looked at me across the room with an expression that wasn't guilt. It was assessment, like she was pricing out furniture she planned to replace. The second time was at the courthouse itself, months later, and by then, her expression had changed completely. By August of 2023, I had moved into my sister Kate's guest room in Woodbridge. Because the McLean house was under a temporary occupancy order, I didn't have the energy to fight. And Kate, for the first time in our adult lives, started asking questions instead of assuming answers. "What did you actually do over there?" she asked me one night, sitting on the edge of the guest bed with 2 glasses of bourbon, the real version, not the recruiting poster version. I told her I couldn't say most of it. She nodded, and for the first time since 2011, she didn't push, and she didn't assume the silence meant there was nothing behind it. That was the beginning of something between us that I didn't have language for yet. Not an apology, because she'd never mocked me directly, but a recalibration. My father called twice that summer. Both times he asked about the house, about the money, about whether Marcus's firm connections would make things difficult for me. Neither time did he ask if I was all right. Neither time did he ask about the seizure. I stopped picking up his calls in September. There is a particular smell I associate with the Inova Fairfax Neurology Wing. Antiseptic layered over old carpet, a vending machine hum that never quite stops. And I went back there 11 more times that summer and fall for testing. EEG leads gelled into my scalp, a technician reading a screen with the same careful blankness Patricia used in mediation. I never told my father about a single one of those appointments. I told Kate about most of them, and by September she'd started driving me to the ones that ran past dinner, sitting in the waiting room with a paperback she never actually read, watching the door instead. Nobody in my father's house ever asked why my hands sometimes shook at Sunday dinner that fall, a small tremor left over from the seizure medication dosage we were still calibrating. Kate noticed within a week. She started cutting my portions smaller without comment, the way you do for someone whose hands you've decided to protect, without announcing that you're protecting them. I kept my dress blues in a garment bag in Kate's hall closet that summer, because I couldn't yet look at them hanging in a closet that was supposed to be temporary. The Bronze Star ribbon lived in a small velvet box inside the jacket's inner pocket, and some nights, after Kate had gone to bed, I'd take it out and just hold it. Not out of pride exactly, more like checking a pulse, confirming that the thing my father had laughed at in front of 40 relatives was still, factually, real. Still pinned to fabric, still mine, regardless of who believed it. If you've made it this far, you already know what it feels like to carry something people refuse to see. So hit that subscribe button now, because the next part is where the sealed file stops being a rumor in a glove box and starts becoming the thing that ends this entire case. And trust me, you do not want to miss how it happens. Patricia filed a formal request for my complete service record in September, invoking a federal statute that allows classified personnel files to be reviewed, under seal, by a judge in cases involving disability benefit disputes tied to a service member's rated condition. Callahan objected 3 separate times. Each objection was denied. What Callahan didn't understand, what he never bothered to understand, because understanding my career would have required treating me as a credible source about my own life, was that the file he was trying to keep out of the case was the exact file that would end his entire strategy. He was betting that a woman he'd already decided was administrative couldn't possibly have a record dense enough to overrule an accusation of malingering. He was wrong, and the file was already moving through the Department of Defense review process by the time he realized it. In October, the accusation escalated. Callahan filed a motion requesting an independent medical evaluation, arguing that my treating neurologist's diagnosis was compromised by sympathy bias, a phrase Patricia later told me she'd seen him use verbatim in 2 other cases. The motion also referenced, for the first time in writing, a specific claim that I had a documented history of exaggerating job responsibilities, citing my father's own sworn statement, because Marcus's team had contacted my father directly, and my father, without calling me first, without asking a single question, had signed an affidavit stating that in his opinion, based on decades of conversation with me, my military role had been largely clerical in nature. I read that affidavit sitting in Patricia's office, and for the only time in this entire ordeal, my hands shook. Not my voice, my hands. Patricia let me sit with it for exactly 30 seconds before she said, "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Your father's affidavit doesn't hurt you. It hurts him, permanently, on public record, the moment we introduce contradicting evidence, and we are going to have contradicting evidence." She was right, though I didn't fully believe her yet. Diane Kessler found one more occasion to repeat herself before the hearing. In November, at a mutual friend's holiday open house in Great Falls that I almost didn't attend, she approached me by the coat rack this time, no dessert table to hide behind, and said, loud enough for 2 other guests to hear, "I do hope this legal theatre settles quickly, for Marcus's sake. It can't be good for a person to keep performing illness this long." I set down my coffee cup, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds and said, "Diane, I hope your son's attorney has malpractice insurance," and walked away before she could construct a response. She did not attend the hearing in January, though I later learned she'd asked Marcus for a full account of it by phone that same evening, twice. Roger Callahan, for his part, found a second occasion for his performance in December, during a pre-trial deposition in a windowless conference room on the 9th floor. He spent 40 minutes walking me through my administrative duties, reading from a list he claimed his office had compiled from publicly available information about logistics officers, a list that bore no resemblance to anything I had actually done, and that Patricia, sitting beside me, quietly annotated line by line for later use. At one point he leaned back in his chair and said, almost conversationally, "You understand, Colonel, that a jury, or in this case the court, tends to be skeptical of claims that can't be substantiated. Paperwork can say anything." Patricia didn't even look up from her legal pad. "Careful, Roger," she said again, the second time she'd used that exact phrase. "You keep building arguments around things you haven't verified." The mechanism that would break this case open had a name. Eventually, After Action Report 04 Delta, Operation Coldbrook Ridge, filed originally in December 2013, classified secret/no fawn, partially declassified under review in November 2023, specifically for the purposes of this civil proceeding, with redactions approved by a review board at the Department of Defense. What that report documented, in language stripped of everything except operational fact, was this. On December 9, 2013, in Kandahar Province, then Captain Sarah Doyle coordinated the emergency extraction of a 6-man special operations element under sustained enemy contact, remaining at a forward casualty collection point for 11 hours, while directly managing medevac routing for 3 critically wounded soldiers, sustaining a traumatic brain injury herself when a mortar round detonated approximately 40 meters from her position, and refusing evacuation until the last of the wounded soldiers under her coordination had been extracted. The report was signed by the operation's ground force commander, a then lieutenant colonel, now Major General, named Robert Halloway. That was the pending exam. That was the sealed envelope. That was the reason my personnel file had been flagged in March, because 11 years later, a delayed neurological consequence of that mortar strike had finally caught up to me in a McLean kitchen, and my own husband's lawyer had decided the safest legal strategy was to call it fake. The hearing was scheduled for January 22, 2024, in the Fairfax County Circuit Court, Courtroom 4B, before Judge Miriam Castellano, a 19-year veteran of the family law bench, known for a courtroom so quiet you could hear the radiator click. I want to describe that room to you, because I remember every detail of it with a clarity I usually reserve for combat zones. The wood paneling was the color of strong tea. The gallery benches were half full. Patricia had subpoenaed enough witnesses, and word travels fast in a courthouse, that by 9 a.m. there were at least a dozen people in uniform sitting in the back rows, men and women I'd served with, some I hadn't spoken to in years, who had heard through the veteran grapevine what this hearing was actually about. My sister Kate sat in the second row. My mother sat beside her. Not my father. My father had been advised by his own attorney friend not to appear, given the affidavit. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table in a navy suit that cost more than my first car. Callahan beside him, Whitney 2 rows back in the gallery, close enough to watch, far enough to claim distance if anyone asked. Diane Kessler sat directly behind her son, arms folded, wearing the same expression she'd worn at that birthday lunch over the dessert table. I wore my Class A uniform that morning, not the dress blues my father had laughed at, the service uniform, ribbons in order, name tape reading Doyle, because Patricia had advised, gently, that the court should see the name on my record before it heard the one on my marriage certificate. The wool was warmer than the courtroom needed, and I remember the specific weight of it settling on my shoulders as I sat down, a weight I hadn't felt since my retirement ceremony, familiar in a way that steadied my pulse before Judge Castellano even took the bench. Bailiff Reyes, no relation to Patricia, a coincidence Patricia found privately amusing, called the room to order at 9:02 a.m., and the sound of Judge Castellano's gavel, one single controlled strike, echoed off the wood paneling in a way that made the whole gallery go still at once, coats still half off shoulders, coffee cups suspended halfway to mouths. Callahan opened aggressively. He walked the court through what he called a pattern of exaggeration, referencing my father's affidavit first, reading the phrase, largely clerical in nature, out loud, slowly, letting it sit in the room. Then he moved to the medical claim, calling my treating physician compromised, and then, in the moment I remember most vividly, he turned to face the gallery, not the judge, the gallery, because Callahan had always understood that some arguments are performances, and said, "The truth, Your Honor, is that this entire disability claim, this entire narrative of sacrifice, is built on a foundation of paperwork." She was never a soldier in any operational sense. She was a secretary in a uniform, and now that uniform is being used as a shield against a straightforward division of marital assets. The gallery went silent in a way that had a texture to it, a held breath. Kate's hand, my sister told me later, was gripping the bench so hard her knuckles went white. Patricia stood. She didn't raise her voice either. She never did. Not once in this entire case. And I understood by then that this was deliberate. A mirror held up to Callahan's theatrics. Your Honor, she said, opposing counsel has just characterized my client's entire military career, under oath, in open court, without ever once reviewing her actual service record, because until this morning, that record was classified. I would like to change that. Judge Castellano nodded, and the courtroom doors, which Patricia had arranged in advance with the bailiff, opened. Major General Robert Halloway walked in wearing his Class A dress uniform, 2 silver stars on each shoulder, and the room did what rooms do when a 2-star general enters. It stood, instinctively, uniformed veterans in the gallery rising before their brains had caught up with their bodies, a ripple of motion through the wooden benches. He walked past the plaintiff's table without looking at Marcus or Callahan, stopped in front of the witness stand, turned toward me at the defense table, and rendered a formal salute, to me, before he turned to the judge. I stood, because that's what you do, and I returned it, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in 11 years, since a mortar round, and a casualty collection point, and a promise I'd made to 3 wounded men that I would not leave until they were gone. General Halloway took the stand and read, in full, the declassified summary of After Action Report 04 Delta. He described the 11 hours at the casualty collection point. He described the mortar strike, the concussion, my refusal of evacuation. He said, verbatim, a sentence that Patricia had asked him to include, and that I will remember until the day I die. Then Captain Doyle's neurological injury, sustained in direct combat operations under my command, is not alleged. It is documented, decorated, and it is the reason 3 soldiers under my authority are alive today to attend their children's graduations. Then he looked directly at Callahan and said, I would encourage counsel to be considerably more careful about the word secretary. The courtroom did not erupt, because Judge Castellano's courtroom didn't allow for that, but I watched it happen in smaller ways. A veteran in the 3rd row lowering his head, my mother's hand rising to her mouth, Whitney's posture in the gallery collapsing inward by degrees, Diane Kessler's folded arms slowly unfolding, as if the air had gone out of whatever had been holding them there. Marcus stared at the table in front of him, and did not look up for the rest of the hearing. Patricia wasn't finished. She introduced, next, a forensic financial review that had nothing to do with the military file and everything to do with Lupe's darker cousin. A set of transfers, totaling $118,000 over 14 months, moved from a joint investment account into an account under Whitney Prentice's name. The same 14 months during which Marcus had been telling me our savings were tight and that my retirement pension should probably cover more of the mortgage going forward. Callahan's face, for the first time all morning, lost its rehearsed calm. He asked for a recess. Judge Castellano denied it. Then Judge Castellano spoke, and this is the moment the whole case had been building toward. The callback Patricia and I had discussed, but never dared to fully expect would land this cleanly. She looked at the courtroom, at Callahan, at Marcus, and said, Mr. Callahan referred to the respondent's military career as, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript, a secretary in a uniform. Based on the record now before this court, a documented combat decoration, 11 hours at a casualty collection point, a traumatic brain injury sustained saving the lives of 3 American soldiers, and a general officer who walked into my courtroom to say so under oath. I would say the only person in this proceeding who has been operating under a false administrative label is the petitioner's own counsel's argument. The phrase, she's just playing dress-up, the thing my father had said at Christmas, the thing Callahan had echoed in different words for months, had just been returned, inverted, by a judge in a Fairfax County courtroom, in front of everyone who had ever doubted it. The ruling that followed took another 40 minutes to read into the record, but the substance of it reshaped everything. Judge Castellano granted full validity to my disability rating and ordered Callahan's firm, sanctioned for what she called a bad faith medical challenge, unsupported by any credible evidence, and directly contradicted by federal military records. She awarded me 62% of the marital estate, citing the concealed transfers to Whitney Prentice as dissipation of marital assets, and ordered Marcus to cover $340,000 in retroactive spousal support calculations, tied to the years he'd told people I did scheduling stuff. My full military pension, $6,840 a month, remained entirely mine, untouched, unchallenged, no longer a line item in someone else's malingering theory. I stood outside the courthouse afterward on the stone steps. January cold enough that my breath fogged in front of me, and General Holloway shook my hand and said, "Kessler, Doyle, I should say, if you're going back to it, you should have called me the day that envelope showed up in your glove box. I'd have come sooner." I told him I didn't know I was allowed to ask. He said, "You earned the right to ask a long time ago, Colonel. That's what today was for." His grip was firm, unhurried, the handshake of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be that afternoon. The weeks that followed reshaped my family in ways I'm still learning to describe. Roger Callahan's firm, Bramwell and Cross, quietly ended its association with him by March. 2 other clients he'd built the same malingering defense strategy for filed formal bar complaints once the Fairfax ruling became public record among the local family law community. Diane Kessler stopped attending family functions where I might be present, though I later heard from Marcus's cousin that she'd started telling a very different version of the courtroom story at her book club, one where she'd always known I was more than people gave me credit for. I don't believe her, but I also don't need her to believe herself. Whitney Prentice was let go from her firm in April, after word of the asset transfers reached partners who didn't appreciate the associated liability. I heard she moved to Charlotte. I felt nothing about that, which surprised me more than feeling something would have. My father called in February, 5 weeks after the hearing. It was the first time in our entire relationship that I heard him apologize without qualifying it. He said, "I signed that affidavit because I believed I knew you, and I didn't. I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have asked." I told him it was 11 years too late, and exactly on time, both true at once. We talk now, once a week, and he started asking questions instead of assuming answers, the way Kate had months earlier in that guest bedroom in Woodbridge. It isn't a movie ending. He still occasionally reaches for the old comparison out of habit, catches himself mid-sentence and stops. That's more than I expected from him, and I've decided that's allowed to be enough. Marcus and I speak only through attorneys now, which is its own kind of mercy. I moved into a townhouse in Fairfax that April, closer to Kate, and closer to a VA clinic that finally treats my neurology file as evidence instead of an inconvenience. I retired officially that summer, 12 years, 4 months, and 11 days of service. A Bronze Star with Valor device, I'm still not permitted to fully explain. A pension of $6,840 a month, nobody gets to question again, and a name on the paperwork, Doyle, that finally matched the one General Holloway had saluted first. The garment bag came out of Kate's hall closet in May. I hung the dress blues in my own closet, in my own townhouse, and I put the Bronze Star ribbon back in its velvet box on the dresser, where I could see it every morning, instead of holding it in the dark, like something I needed to keep proving to myself. Some evenings I still catch myself listening for the sound of that gavel, one clean strike against wood, the way you keep hearing a door slam long after the argument that caused it is over. General Holloway sends a card every December now, no note beyond his signature and a single line, "Still standing, Colonel," and I keep every one of them in the same drawer as the ribbon. Kate got engaged that October, to a physical therapist named James, who spent an entire Thanksgiving asking me careful, specific questions about physical rehabilitation protocols for TBI patients. Questions that told me exactly how much Kate had told him, and exactly how differently this family was learning to talk about the things it used to laugh off. My mother, Linda, sat at that same Thanksgiving table and, unprompted, told James the story of the courtroom salute, in full, correct detail, down to the 2 silver stars on Holloway's shoulders. A version of the story I don't think she'd have been capable of telling accurately a year earlier. If there's one thing I'd want you to carry out of this story, it's this. The people who decide your worth without asking you a single real question about your life are not judging your service, or your career, or your sacrifice. They're judging their own comfort, because it's easier to call something small than to sit with how much they never bothered to understand. I spent over a decade letting my own family write a smaller version of me, because the real version required questions they didn't want to ask. What version of you is someone in your life still choosing not to see, simply because asking would cost them something? 2 days after the ruling, Kate told me our mother had started going through an old box in the garage, the one with my deployment photos nobody had ever asked to see, the ones still sealed in a manila envelope stamped with a unit designation my father had never once asked me to explain, and found something folded at the very bottom of it. Something dated December 2013. Something with General Holloway's signature already on it, 11 years before he ever walked into that courtroom. Something that changed the way she'd tell this story to her own grandchildren for the rest of her life.